As we've talked about in previous History Of videos on this channel, the Haunted Mansion is one of Disneyland's oldest operating rides, and on top of that it's one of the few that's remained virtually untouched since its opening. However, even though the ride hasn't seen any big permanent changes, it does undergo a very large temporary change every year. But in order to talk about a change of this magnitude, I couldn't do it alone. That's why I brought on everyone's favorite Disney character, the one and only Disney Dan.
That's right, Jack, and in this video, we'll be diving into the history of the Haunted Mansion holiday.
For those of you who aren't familiar with it, the Haunted Mansion holiday is a seasonal overlay for Disneyland's Haunted Mansion. The overlay is based on the 1993 animated Disney film The Nightmare Before Christmas, and adds many of the movie's characters, settings, and songs into the attraction, in the process creating an entirely new ride experience. But before we go talking about what all the overlay offers, let's take a quick look back at its history. By the late 90s, Disneyland was known to host two Christmas-themed seasonal overlays for some of the original attractions they had there. Those two being the Country Bear Christmas Special for the Country Bear Jamboree, which they had been doing since 1984, and more recently, It's a Small World Holiday for It's a Small World since 1997, both of which made some slight adjustments to the original attractions and gave them more of a holiday feel.
Given the success those two overlays saw in terms of attracting visitors who otherwise wouldn't go on those same rides, Disney began looking for a way to introduce another, newer one into the park.
And since it was more effective to update older and more classic attractions that weren't already stacking up huge wait times, they eventually chose the Haunted Mansion. From there, the Imagineers considered some of the different options they had when it came to the ride's new story, and one of the first ones they came up with was to base it off A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, changing certain scenes in the mansion to match those in the book, essentially using the ride to tell that same story. Basing the overlay off A Christmas Carol would have been practical for a couple different reasons. The first being that the story already matched the mansion's creepy atmosphere, so it wouldn't really be that difficult to change the ride's theming. And secondly, it would give Disneyland a Halloween-themed overlay, which they thought would contrast nicely with the two Christmas-themed ones they already had. However, it wasn't long before that idea was thrown out entirely, mostly because of the many thematic inconsistencies, the most glaring of which being the fact that the story takes place during the 19th century in London, and the Haunted Mansion is supposed to be in 18th century Louisiana.
But despite that, Disney was still interested in introducing a new holiday overlay to the Haunted Mansion, and, luckily enough, they soon found just what they were looking for in the animated movie The Nightmare Before Christmas.
When the movie first debuted in 1993, it saw great reviews from critics and the average moviegoer alike, leading it to eventually gross more than $50 million on its first theatrical run, far more than any of Disney's executives at the time expected it to. Not too long after that, development on the Haunted Mansion holiday began. The project was mainly spearheaded by Imagineer Steve Davison. He, alongside other Disney Imagineers and artists, began to sift through the original film, looking for scenes and imagery that they could use throughout the attraction. For the most part, finding things from the movie to introduce into the mansion didn't prove to be all too difficult. Instead, the main issue was finding a way to do so without significantly altering the original attraction. In other words, they wanted to make the overlay stand out as a new experience, but they didn't want riders to forget that they were in the Haunted Mansion, keeping in mind the fact that this was an overlay and not its own new ride. Another big issue they faced while recreating some of the original ride scenes was that a lot of the same people who acted or voice acted in it were now dead. In order to update those scenes those performers were in, they began to look for replacements who could kind of capture the original essence of those roles, which they eventually did by bringing on people like Corey Burton to be the new ghost host, Kim Irvine and Susan Blakesley for Madame Leota, and a whole new quintet of singing busts.
Once the Imagineers had finalized some of their new concepts for the overlay, the Haunted Mansion was temporarily closed in August of 2001 in order to have all of the new set pieces added. A little under 2 months after that, Disney officially reopened the attraction under its new name, the Haunted Mansion Holiday.
The ride was almost completely rethemed. Everything from the stretching room to the graveyard saw some pretty major changes, so let's go through all those now. Before we get started on all the changes, I feel the need to mention the fact that the overlay isn't exactly the same every time it comes back. With each new year, there are a few minor additions or tweaks that the overlay sees. So for the Changes To section of this video, I'll only be delving into the big additions the mansion sees when it's overlaid, and the changes those same additions might have seen throughout the last 17 years. The first big change the mansion saw was with its exterior. While the original mansion was designed to look mostly normal and blend in with the rest of the New Orleans square, it's now a lot more, let's just say, festive, with a multitude of new props, decorations, and lighting. Aside from now being almost completely covered in pumpkins and candles, there's also some other new props scattered around. Moving on into the actual mansion, you'll notice that just about everything is now decked out in garland, a pretty common theme throughout most of the other scenes in the ride as well. In the pre-show room, all of the original portraits have been replaced with stained glass windows, depicting various Christmas-like scenes. As the pre-show starts and the room begins to stretch, the stained glass windows break off, revealing the more Halloween-like pictures behind them. The pre-show is then topped off with Jack's face appearing on the piece of scrim that normally reveals the ghost host. However, that part of the pre-show was later changed in 2013, and now shows an animated Jack crashing through the glass ceiling. Once you leave the stretching room, the hallway that leads into the loading area has also been redecorated, with things like new lights put in front of the moving busts, and the original changing portraits being replaced by some new holiday-themed ones. The loading area itself wasn't changed too much aside from some Christmas furnishings here and there. The real main addition in that area has to be the giant Christmas card cutout on the other side of the ride vehicles. After boarding, and as you go up into the rest of the ride, you'll begin to see some very brightly colored Christmas presents, which, much like the garland, are pretty heavily used throughout most of the ride. The first scene we come across is the Endless Hallway, which now includes Jack's ghost dog, Zero, who replaced the floating candelabra that was previously in that same hallway. The rest of the scene has also been redecorated with quite a few dog bones, and the animatronic knight now has a pumpkin on his head, because, it's Halloween, why not have a pumpkin on his head? Similarly, the conservatorium and corridor of doors both also managed to stay pretty much the same as well, only being slightly tweaked by including a few new things like the singing flowers in the conservatorium and the man-eating wreath in the corridor of doors. Next up is Madame Leota's seance room, which now features Leota reciting the 13 Days of Christmas spiel instead of her usual seance. They also removed all of the original floating props in that room as well, and replaced them with big playing cards that'll spin and rotate in accordance with Leota's new seance. Moving on into the ballroom, you'll notice quite a few big changes. First off, and hardest to miss, is the giant gingerbread house on the table, which is completely new. The house is actually different every year, as per request of the movie's producer, Tim Burton, and is made of real gingerbread. Ever since the attraction's grand opening in 2001, the houses have managed to get bigger and more complex every year, with more and more moving parts on them. There was also the addition of a brand new room in the ballroom as well. In the original ride, there's a staircase on the opposite side of the room that leads up to a door that's always been closed, but now when the attraction becomes the Haunted Mansion Holiday, that door is opened, revealing a library with a stack of spinning books inside it. They also changed up a few of the original animatronics in that scene as well. For instance, the two duelists who used to endlessly shoot each other are now focusing their gunfire on Zero, who can be seen flying around the top of the Christmas tree. From there, we go into the attic, which was almost entirely changed. Pretty much none of the original story elements are there anymore, including the bride animatronic and wedding photos. In their place are a whole lot of presents and a giant snake that's eating the naughty or nice list. Back in 2015, when Imagineers first re-added the Hatbox Ghost into the original attraction, they really didn't have any idea what to do with it for the overlay, so they just put a pin on his hat and threw some Santa hats around him, which is how he still looks today. But since the animatronic itself is still only about 3 years old, I wouldn't rule out the idea of them doing something more permanent with him soon enough. Finally, we have the graveyard scene, which is now totally covered in snow and Christmas decor. On top of that, we see the addition of things like the Ice Angels, Pumpkin Mountain, and Jack Skellington. They also slightly changed things like the singing busts and pop-up ghosts by putting pumpkins and Santa hats on them. In 2016, the Imagineers officially brought Sally from the movie into the ride, when they added a new animatronic of her in the graveyard. Lastly, the original overlay used to feature Lock, Shock, and Barrel in place of the hitchhiking ghosts. They stayed there for the first 2 years of the overlay before being replaced in 2003 by an Oogie Boogie animatronic. Along with him, they also added a wheel that'll decide what kind of present you'll be able to see in your ride vehicle, instead of the regular hitchhiking ghosts. And that's about all the changes the mansion sees during the overlay. Give or take a few, I'm sure you guys will point out, but even still, that's really saying a lot. It's pretty impressive how just those few changes, mixed with things like a new soundtrack and lighting, can completely change the feel of an attraction, especially one as unique as the Haunted Mansion.
In the years after its opening, the Haunted Mansion holiday became a favorite amongst parkgoers, especially Disneyland pass holders who are now able to enjoy a new experience that was only available for a limited time.
Due to its positive reception, Imagineers started out on plans to create a similar overlay for the Magic Kingdom's Haunted Mansion in 2003, but Disney World officials ended up rejecting the concept. After that, all the duplicate props that were made for it were sent out to Japan to be used on Tokyo Disneyland's Haunted Mansion, which started its yearly overlay in 2004. In all honesty, I hope if Disney ever does create any more overlays for their classic attractions, they end up being as well executed and liked as the Haunted Mansion holiday was and still is today. Of course, a very special thanks to our pal Disney Dan for being a part of this video. It is always a treat to have him here with us. And as for you, my lovely viewers, we still have much to talk about before the month's over, so I feel more than confident when I say, I'll see you all a little later.
You know, Halloween is truly a magical time, and what better place to be than right here in the Magic Kingdom, right in front of the magic shop with a bunch of magical guests.